Now, unless you've been living under the proverbial rock for the past week or so, you've no doubt heard about the passing of Stan Lee, a man who I would consider one of the three greatest and most influential storytellers of our time, or shapers of modern fiction, with the other two being J.R.R. Tolkien, who is basically the father of the fantasy genre as we know it today, and George Lucas, who changed our perceptions of what movies could look and sound like by giving us a story as old as time, that being the hero's journey, told in a completely new and different way. And yes, I might be just a little biased with those choices because my three favorite franchises of all time are Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, and Marvel Comics, and there are certainly others who have helped shape the world of fiction or pop culture as we know it today. The most recent example being perhaps J.K. Rowling with the Harry Potter series, who, if for no other reason, gets my admiration for getting an entire generation of kids to read in an age where the internet was really starting to come into its own and become the primary source of entertainment for many people, especially the young. Anyway, I think it would be hard to argue against the importance of Lee, Tolkien, and Lucas to modern fiction, and the point of the video is not to make an argument for them to be regarded as the icons I believe them to be, though you're certainly free to make one against them, or for others in the comments below, because I'd love to know who you'd consider the three most influential storytellers of our age. Instead, what I do want to talk about a bit here is why the film industry is dominated today by remakes and long-standing franchises, and why sometimes these franchises or remakes are loved and embraced by fans, and other times they're flat out rejected. There's probably no better place to start than with the incredible success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and how it's thanks in large part to the way it uses and tries to honor and stay as true as it can to its long-standing characters that in many cases were creations of Stan Lee. And that really has been the key to the MCU's success, I believe, that Kevin Feige, the president of Marvel Studios and designer and overseer of the MCU, has indeed tried to stay true to what these characters always have been, with perhaps the only real exception being Thor, who has become radically different from what he originally was in the comics. But otherwise, Feige and the writers and directors of the MCU movies have taken these characters and not tried to completely reinvent or reimagine them, because they realize the reasons they appealed to people 50-some years ago when they were first created hasn't changed and never will, nor has there been any type of real-world agenda pushed by any of the MCU movies to date, short of making money, of course. In other words, it's been all about taking the original ideas, concepts, and characters of Stan Lee, among others of course, and trying to tell great stories and just make quality movies that both long-standing fans of Marvel and newcomers alike can and do enjoy. That's it. That's been the plan and goal since day one, and now here we are, 10 years later, and they're the record-breaking kings at the box office. And go figure that just focusing on great stories, made up of great characters, has led to unrivaled success in the history of film, as Marvel has now officially grossed more than any other franchise in history. And I don't know if there's ever been a better example of the old saying that if you do what you love, the money will follow, because Feige has been doing what he loves and giving the fans what they love, and the money has certainly been following. Hiring someone with a true passion and reverence for the source material has been the secret to Marvel's success, though I don't know if it should be called a secret, because it's actually a formula that's so simple, you wonder how anyone ever gets it wrong. But of course, you do need good source material to honor it in the first place, which Marvel certainly has thanks in large part again to Stan Lee, who was one of the first to actually put the human in superhuman by creating relatable, everyday characters with flaws and weaknesses that just so happen to have incredible powers. In fact, arguably his most beloved character, Spider-Man, was meant to be like every other awkward and maybe slightly nerdy teenage boy who just so happened to get bit by a radioactive spider one day. But the MCU isn't the only example of the type of success that can come by staying as true as you possibly can to the original work and honoring what it is at its core. The Lord of the Rings films, brought to us by Peter Jackson, were a massive success because they brought the beloved books to life in a way that I can only imagine Tolkien himself would have not only approved of, but been amazed by. In fact, one of the things I truly appreciate about the movies, coming from someone who's read the books roughly a half dozen times in his life, is how faithful they are to the original story. But then you move on to the Hobbit trilogy, also made by Peter Jackson and of course based on the book of the same name by Tolkien, and it's not as loved and adored by most fans as the Lord of the Rings trilogy was. And one of the reasons for that is way too many creative licenses were taken here, and one relatively short book was split up into 3 movies, which, intended as one or not, comes off as feeling like a straight-up cash grab. They also, in my opinion, had a completely different look and feel to them, though in Jackson's defense, The Hobbit has a much different feel to it than the Lord of the Rings books do, with the former being much more of a kid's book than the latter. Nevertheless, the different feel didn't work for many fans because it conflicted with the more grounded and realistic feel of The Lord of the Rings, which took itself very seriously. So seriously, in fact, that those movies almost feel like they're based on real people and real events, like a documentary of sorts about the actual land of Middle-earth, as crazy as that sounds. And that's something you very rarely find in fantasy movies, or perhaps I should say is rarely pulled off in fantasy movies. But again, it goes back to everyone involved wanting to honor the original works of Tolkien. On the other hand, the Hobbit movies, right or wrong, decided to embrace the more fanciful side of storytelling, if you will, and many of the characters and their actions come off feeling a bit too cartoonish. And don't get me wrong here, in many ways the Hobbit movies are a good representation of the book, which you certainly could applaud Jackson for. But again, there's too much filler or creative license taken here, and the characters don't feel quite like real, living, breathing people as they did in The Lord of the Rings. Which now brings us to the third person on my list, that being George Lucas and the success of the original Star Wars trilogy and relative failure of the prequel trilogy in comparison. And it's actually kind of funny how, in many ways, the two Star Wars and Lord of the Rings trilogies are mirrors of each other, because much like with Lord of the Rings, a big part of the success of the original Star Wars movie was how seriously it took itself. Because though in many ways the first Star Wars movie, or A New Hope, could be seen as a fairy tale and the whole situation is beyond incredible or even ridiculous, the characters in it are very grounded and relatable. That's actually one of the main reasons it even works, and why most of them have become pop culture icons today. Because, much like with The Lord of the Rings, the characters in the first Star Wars trilogy in general feel like real people who just happen to be living in a galaxy far, far away. However, the prequel trilogy, much like the Hobbit trilogy, didn't feel like it took itself quite as seriously. Many, if not most, of the characters in the prequels are not quite as relatable or don't feel as human as their original trilogy counterparts. They don't feel like real people who just happen to be living in a much different setting from our own. In fact, one of them, Jar Jar Binks, is pretty much a straight-up cartoon character, which for many people prevents them from ever being able to fully immerse themselves in the story, or stops them from believing this really did happen a long, long time ago. And though I do enjoy the prequels, and can certainly respect the fact that Lucas wanted to do something completely different with them, it's hard to argue that they weren't what many fans were hoping for or expecting. But since Lucas is the original creator of Star Wars, it's hard to argue that he shouldn't have been allowed to do whatever he damn well pleases with Star Wars. That being said, however, fans also have every right not to like what he's created, which leads us not only to the modern era of Star Wars, but the current state of the entertainment industry in general. Because nowadays, as mentioned earlier, remakes and continuations of long-standing franchises are the norm in the film industry, but more often than not, they're not being made or handled by the original creators of that IP. And not only that, but in some cases, not all, these remakes are not being made to honor the original works, but to benefit from the well-known name and trick both long-standing fans and newcomers who recognize a familiar name into watching something that might be trying to push an agenda or that they simply would have otherwise passed on. And perhaps the best example of this recently is the newest Ghostbuster movie that came out a couple years ago now and featured an all-female team simply for the sake of featuring an all-female team. And as a fan of the original Ghostbusters movies, all I really wanted out of a movie called Ghostbusters is one that tries to honor those original movies, to continue that story. Go figure. I honestly wouldn't have cared one way or another if the new team was all women, if that hadn't seemed to be the point of making the movie in the first place. And to try and be absolutely clear here, I and many others wouldn't have cared or be talking about this now if they just wanted to make a movie with a very similar premise to Ghostbusters that featured the exact same predominantly female cast and crew, but was called something different. But that's kind of the problem, I guess, isn't it? A lot of people wouldn't have cared about the movie if it had not been called Ghostbusters. In other words, it wasn't about trying to make a good remake of Ghostbusters, it was about using the name to get people to watch something and make a point. And to further clarify here, I'm not saying people wouldn't have cared because it was an all-female team. I'm saying they wouldn't have cared because the same premise had already been done and executed flawlessly before. In fact, the original Ghostbusters movie is one of the greatest examples of comedic timing and actors playing off each other that there's ever been. It should be studied by those interested in writing or acting in comedies, not remade by those wanting to just capitalize off its name. But had the movie truly wanted to honor the original and be a continuation of that story and bring in the surviving 3 members of the original Ghostbusters team to, be Ghostbusters still, that were training the next generation, I think that could have easily worked. In fact, I recall reading that was the original plan, to have an all-female team being trained by the original team. And guess what? That sounded like a pretty good idea to me. And now we move on to modern Star Wars, or the Disney era, if you will, and the difficulties it finds itself facing with its fan base. And though there was nothing that could have been done to avoid losing some fans during the transition from being owned by George Lucas himself, the original creator, to being owned by Disney, the biggest name in the entertainment industry, things certainly could have been handled a lot differently to mitigate some of the damage. And without question, in my opinion, the biggest mistake, and you're free to argue against me in the comments below, has been the sequel trilogy and its failure to, in the eyes of many fans, honor the long-standing characters and icons that are the reason Star Wars is what it is today. And though I certainly understand the desire to create new iconic characters, I'm not sure the best way to do it is by tearing down the old ones. I mean, Luke Skywalker was their golden ticket, the character they could have and should have used to all but guarantee the success of this new trilogy and for Disney to start off on the right foot with its fans. Instead, Rian Johnson was allowed to do something creative with him that didn't resonate with a sizable number of fans. Maybe you did enjoy it, and that's certainly fine. You're of course allowed to like whatever you want. But it's hard to argue against the fact that it was a very risky gamble to not give fans the Luke most of us were expecting and waiting 35 years to see. And if there is any truth to the rumors coming out about Episode 9 and how Luke will be used there, I'd say it was a gamble that Disney and Lucasfilm are acknowledging went a bit awry. And now, mercifully for you watching, is where I finally try to make my point. I am all for writers, filmmakers, or what have you being allowed to create and share whatever stories their imaginations can conjure up. That, after all, is the only way we'll ever discover the next Stan Lee, or George Lucas, or Tolkien, or J.K. Rowling, and so on. In other words, I am all for artistic freedom when you're dealing with your own creation. But if you want to reimagine a story that was originally told by another, or tell a story in a universe that was established by someone else, an effort should be made to honor that original work of art. Or don't be surprised when the fans of the original reject your work, and certainly don't blame them for not liking it, and come up with crazy excuses as to why you failed to create something that resonated with the fans. And if you don't like it, then don't try and follow in the footsteps of giants and play in their worlds. Instead, create something original and maybe become the giant yourself. Become that artist that creates a story or world or characters that can stand the test of time and be relatable and inspirational to generations to come. And ask yourself how you'd feel if someone took your creations someday down the road and reimagined them, or use the name to promote something that in no way, shape, or form honors what you once created. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me who you think the 3 most inspirational or influential minds are in the modern era. So leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars, and fiction in general. And until next time, thanks for watching.